back, Einhander again. This is part 2 of a looks to be 2-part video series. Pretty much for all you global folks, all you global techers, from effectively clearing Sodom Depth 100 Techer Luster with Gunslash. And so what we're gonna do now is go through my latest run. I'd actually beat my personal best time on a whim by about a second. I haven't played Sodom in about 4 months in anticipation for NGS, but figured, hey, now that global is doing its thing, might as well hop back on, help you guys out. And so let's get started. We won't go through everything, so I'll speed through things, but really want to highlight the things that I'm doing, why I'm doing them. So now the beginning is very important. So as you notice, I started with charged aim shot. Now, technically there are different ways that you can do this, or say really 2 different ways. Aim shot, start doing things that build voltage. In this case, I would SOFOE to chase into Sodom and then start my rotation. And actually, let me back up a second, because I wouldn't start with SOFOE. I'd actually start with probably an Ein canceling or just attack cancel into Remegit. As you know, with Techer Luster, going from one PA to a technique or one PA to another PA, it gets additional voltage on top of crit, but Remegit's not really for damage. It's really for building that voltage. Now, why do I not go that route and instead go for charged aim shot? When you do something like an Ein cancel into Remegit, especially when we take into account cast speeds, and we talked about cast speeds a little bit in the previous video, Gunslash being slower when you cast techniques. So you think about canceling with Ein, that's 36 frames, or if you think of 60 frames a second, a little bit more than a half a second. And then you're going to go into charging Remegit. Now, of course, Remegit is fast. It's got that 0.5 second or a half second charge speed. But of course, that's when it's fully charged. There's going to be a couple of milliseconds or what have you of when you realize it's charged and you release it. But there's also about another 36 or so frame, or just a little bit more than a half a second release time when you're releasing techniques with Gunslash. And so doing Ein into Remegit to build that voltage, you've already lost a second. In addition, you've also burned a lot of PP in the grand scheme of things, but that's not really important. And so the next thing you're going to do is you're going to have to move forward and eventually chase with SOFOE. And so you can imagine that that's going to take you another second or two just to get to Sodom. Maybe not 2 seconds, but it's going to be like another second. And then during that time, you haven't moved much. You got to remember, when you do Ein, you can't move. So now you're moving forward with Remegit. Remegit's charged, and now you're going to chase with SOFOE. It's been about 2 to 3 seconds, and that's when you start your damage rotation. Now, with that said, in doing this, you will build more voltage than my method of just charging. We talked about 2 to 3 seconds, right? That's time that you're not doing damage, especially in this form of Sodom. As you'll notice, there is no elemental weakness. And that's something you want to be mindful of, because this is when you're going to be doing the least amount of damage. It's just one of those unfortunate things. But so let's say it's about 2-3 seconds before you're actually damaging Sodom, just because of the distance that you have to cover and all the other things you're doing to set up that voltage build. Well, that 2 to 3 seconds, I can charge aim shot. Aim shot takes 4 seconds to fully charge. During that charging, I'm walking forward. I'm already clearing that distance as I'm charging the attack. Walk forward, shoot. Look at my positioning to Sodom the minute I shoot. Now, I only did 1 million damage because I didn't crit. That's one of the weaknesses and the chances that you're going to just have to take. Usually when I crit, that goes to about 1.23 million. But now, within 4 seconds, I've done 1 million damage. Once again, this is all about damage at the end of the day. Voltage is important, but we're all about damage and efficient damage. And look at the distance that I've closed. So while you might be already attacking Sodom with your Remegit and building that voltage, have you covered within, let's say, a second, maybe even a second and a half, have you covered 1 million damage? Or if you get lucky, 1.2 million damage? Likely not. Now you will get more voltage, but we'll get into why that's also not necessarily the greatest thing when we think about reaching that 500 voltage level. SOFOE, and then I start my voltage rotation. Now there's 2 things here. Another reason why you want to be careful of building voltage or having that voltage focused opener is that you have to be very mindful of your attack rotations. As you realize, and we saw this, and you've probably seen this when you're doing rock bear training just in general, serpent air is one of your greatest techniques, especially as tech or luster where you're stronger in your strike multipliers. The problem is that it elevates you. And there can be many situations that it'll elevate you above your opponent. In rock bear, there will be times where you're not hitting rock bear. Now that isn't necessarily going to be a problem for Sodom, but what's going to happen is you're not going to hit Sodom's core, which is in his middle. You're likely going to be hitting somewhere around the shoulder where the damage isn't as effective. And so in building this voltage and doing these rotations and switching between, let's say Ein and Serpent, because once again, Ein to Serpent, frame for frame, is faster than using Rage Dance. And so if you're building voltage, it's all about hits and speed, and you want to switch between two PAs that are the fastest, it's going to be Ein, it's going to be Serpent. You are going to get yourself in a situation to where Serpent is going to be less effective because you're still hitting and building voltage, sure, but you're not hitting in the optimal region. And as you even see here, my Ein is pretty high and I'm pretty close too. So I'm pretty sure this Ein is also not hitting in the optimal region. So I am losing damage at the cost of building voltage. And of course, we want to focus on my voltage here to see how much voltage I get by the time I start casting my first Remegade. And we'll get into where I cast my first Remegade, I feel like is more beneficial than casting at the beginning. So I'm at 92. I should be a little bit more when he reappears because my last Ein slash should still be proccing. I cast Remegade into Xanverse, and this is where I start my damage. Now, the reason for this is the goal is to hit 500 voltage. If you did Remegade at the beginning, maybe you've got about, 30, 40 more voltage to me, but you're going to run out of that Remegade. So not only were you not effectively doing damage, you also weren't effectively using Remegade because in casting it at the beginning of the match, so far away from Sodom, that 2, 3, 4 seconds, you're not optimizing that Remegade damage anyway. And so, of course, Remegade being 20 seconds, you've lost 25% without doing anything. But doing charged aim shot and getting that damage in and then starting your voltage, casting Remegade Xanverse here, not only are you trying to optimize and maximize that damage to burn Sodom down, you started your Remegade at a more effective state where it's hitting and doing its job and building that voltage immediately while you still continue to do damage. Now, you'll notice here I'm not dodging, and this is on purpose. This is one of the things that as you get more comfortable with Sodom, you're really going to have to think about, which is, when do I take hits? When should I take hits? Because there are situations where you should take hits. Dodging or doing something to avoid it is less optimal, but of course when I shouldn't. Now my mindset here is I'm trying to go for the fastest time. I'm trying to burn Sodom down. There's some things that I need him to do early to try and ensure that. This goes into one of the techniques we talked about in the last video, which is the Ein guard frames to not only make your crass procs if you're using the crass Gunslash and the massive hunter or the massive bonus, but also a way to find efficient ways where Sodom is not moving to recover your PP when need be. So as you see, Sodom is doing this big flame pillar. I start spamming Eins in preparation to guard frame it and also to build my voltage. And then I actually activate crass and get my PP back. Crass is back. That stagger, you see how he jumped back? That's what I'm aiming for. Luckily, this was a good RNG where he didn't move around too much, but that stagger, that's the first thing you're looking for. You want that in depth 100 to happen as fast as possible. It's just one of those things, those tells of you've hit a certain threshold. And so focusing on damage and trying to hit that threshold as fast as possible before he starts moving around. He moves around. Now this is where I use Sophoe. Why? Once again, I dodged his attack just because he's moving away. Don't want to take that hit. It's not worth it. Sometimes I do use Ein. As you notice, there's an Ein blade, but I'm too low to the ground. So if I were to use Strez, we have an issue because I will likely hit him, though there's a chance I could miss and then I'm just floating in the air doing nothing, but I'm going to dash straight at his legs. And this is why I have Sophoe, so that I can reset and get into the most optimal position. Now here, This is the twirl that we talked about a little bit in the last video. Now, I did mess this up. I mistimed it, but that's not important. Essentially, what I was trying to do was I was trying to guard frame the ein, because it's what I'm going to do next, which is Zanverse. Now, didn't get the timing in because, to be honest, it can be very difficult to tell when Sodom's actually going to do his twirl. It's semi-random when he chooses to do it, and so it's better than me using step dodge. Why? Because I maintain my position. He's going to come down straight on top of me so that when I Zanverse, I'm going to drop to the ground, I jump back up, I'm back in the ideal position. Versus if I were to step dodge it, I would be somewhere not in front of him. And while that's not necessarily the end of the world, once again, trying to effectively pump in my damage, at least from my perspective. Here, I do something that's not the greatest. As you notice, he jumped back. And I did an ein, and I let the ein complete and shoot. Because it is good damage, I did about 427,000 damage. In certain situations, I'll even do upwards to 517 once everything is that's kind of a bad habit, and there's other things of doing, such as dashing, repositioning, Safoi, maybe even a stress. Those stress can miss. I do it just because I'm willing to balance the risk of missing that ein shot. For the fact that I do damage, I track him, I stay line of sight, and I can stay on top of him. This is another technique that I use. You can use other things. Add bullet is actually a great choice for this. But for me, it's just something, add bullet or additional bullet, something that I can't do very well on controller for the fact that I have limited weapon palette space and also very hard to navigate through the sub palette with the D-pad. I opt not to use add bullet to keep things simpler for me, but I would say that especially add bullet, if you can work that in, especially in these situations, it's probably the most optimal. But what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna do an ein, and I'm going to actually let it go 100%. And then I'm going to time his gravity ball when it explodes with a stress. So not only do I do the damage of shooting with ein, I'll also get the full damage in with stress. You'll notice that I missed in the last hit 2 hits with stress. That's one of the things that's going to happen. And that's what we talked about in the previous video of stress canceling. When you know, or you're going to see, yeah, Sodom's going to move out of the way, or he's not going to be in a position where stress is going to hit fully. This is where I need to dash cancel or step cancel out of it and go back into Serpent to not only recover the air that I lost, but once again, stay on top of Sodom. Once again, ein for guard frames into Zanverse. Safoi for chase, flame pillar, get my PP back, and then continue the rotations. Because my health was low, it was a little too low, even though I probably could have risked it, I decided to not go for a Megid in this situation. Usually when he goes through phase changes, I will, in this time, Remegid into Zanverse. Push comes to shove and you don't have that timing. What is going to dictate whether you choose Remegid over Zanverse is going to be voltage. Right now I've got high voltage, so while optimally I would like to do both Remegid and Zanverse, didn't work out this time. I decided to make sure my health was higher so that I didn't just blow the run, and then opted for Zanverse because doing that condensed damage versus damage over time. Now, what you saw me do there, because I have the time to do it, and I get a pretty good sense of where Sodom is going to be, was Remegid into Zanverse into charged aim shot. Now, of course, this is going to vary based on where Sodom actually is, where you think he is, and your comfort with running the risk. As you notice, my back was fairly turned and just kind of just knew from the direction of the wind. You'll see later on, there's times where I know where he is. I'm not even looking at him. I'm trying to get Remegid, Zanverse, charge shot. Here it is again. So this time, once again, you saw I did the iron guard because I knew that the twirl was coming, but my voltage is not 500. I don't have high voltage, so I go for remeg. Rule of thumb, remeg always until you're at high voltage. Unless maybe you're like at 450, then Xanverse is probably going to be better because you'll hit 500 during that time. And then if you can't fit both in, Xanverse once you have high voltage. This is pretty standard. Ein to stress, blocks everything. Shot from Ein. Once again, now we do Xanverse. Now I'm taking these hits. You'll see later on I start dodging these hits, but when you have Xanverse on, every millisecond, microsecond matters. And so because my health is pretty good, I'm not going to complain here. I've got 1700. I'm willing to take these hits because dodging costs me time in Xanverse. And when you're using Xanverse, really you want to think about how do I optimize and maximize its usage. And so sometimes when you're in situations where you don't feel like you're going to get the optimal usage out of it, chances are you shouldn't use it. And we could kind of get into the mathematics of it, but essentially, especially when it gets to Gunslash and the damage rotations, if you're not optimizing, let's say 5 seconds or 5.5 seconds, which is the max duration of Xanverse, you might have been better off just doing another photon art instead. You know, depending on your rotations, depending on the situations, sometimes the benefits of Xanverse is when it's used to its most optimal use in like a half second or a second, you know, slower, or not using that additional second can cost you a lot. Now he's stunned. Look at my PP. This is where things get very interesting of why I do this certain rotation. Technically, I can optimize this rotation, but that's not important. Generally, what a lot of people are going to do here is they're going to do their Ein ×3 into Rage Dance into Serpent. Yes, that is the most optimal damage. Now, the problem is that that's going to cost you quite a bit of PP, and you can't determine when Sodom's going to get stunned, and you definitely are not going to know where your PP is going to be. So when it comes to rotations that are effective and consistent, this is one of the ones I recommend. The stun phases is where you do more damage just because he's stunned and not moving, but the amount of damage you do per hit is reduced because you do not have that weakness. And so you also want to be careful of how much PP you deplete and the situations you might put yourself in and how that's going to affect the stages where elemental weakness does play a role. So Ein into Rage Dance. And you noticed I only had 38 PP, never did a normal attack, or maybe I did one normal, but it didn't disrupt me from doing the most effective damage that I had with such low PP. And then of course, as he's beginning to change phases, this is when I start doing my normals to build that PP back up. Now, what I would recommend doing is actually 2 Eins. So Ein and then cancel it into another Ein and let that one fire into Rage Dance. So Ein ×2 into Rage Dance. That is likely going to be the most effective thing. So now I'm going to build PP. I'm going to then make sure I give myself enough time for Remeged into Xanverse. This is important, and then I think after this we can pretty much start skipping to other portions of the video because things are pretty much standard after this. There are individuals who might use charged aim shot in these situations when you're changing phases. Let's say you do 1.2 million in damage. You're not going to be doing that in Xanverse alone. Based on paper, yes, charged aim shot will be better than a Xanverse cast. The problem becomes charged aim shot requires 4 seconds where you can't do anything. And it's funny because at the beginning of the match with Sodom, charged aim shot is probably the most effective, but in these situations, it's not. You have to ask yourself, 4 seconds. How many seconds does Xanverse take? And especially if you've crafted it, it takes what, a half a second? And then with the slow cast speeds of Gunslash, it takes another half second or so for you to cast it. And so if you time Xanverse correctly and you release it right when Sodom reappears from his phase change, you've lost 1 second. And so you have to ask yourself, in those other 3 seconds that you're charging aim shot, what else could you be doing? For me, in this situation, I took the time to regain my PP. Let's say that I had fairly sufficient or even max PP. In those 3 seconds, I could be doing Serpent into Rage, Serpent into Rage, so on and so forth. And in 3 seconds, that's going to effectively net more than 1.2 million. As you can see here, it's hard to see, but this 83,000 right here, that 83,000 is from my Serpent. And if I do the rough math, my Rage Dance hit should be roughly around 91,000. That's generally the damage difference between the two. Serpent Air hits 6 times, right? And so that's essentially, it's 498,000 if you're actually doing the math, but we can say, hey, that's not actually 83,000. We'll just round it up to 500. And so even if I were just to spam Serpent Air 3 times, 1.5 million. There is not a situation, especially given my setup where I'm more strike based, where I'm going to be doing 1.5 million with a charged aim shot. And this is 1.5 million, and this isn't even 3 full seconds. Once again, remember, Serpent is 54 frames. That's 162 frames. That is 18 frames less. Throw in an Ein, let's say, even though the Ein technically is 36 frames, you can imagine all of that damage that you've done in those 3 seconds that you would have been using to charge aim shot. Now you have Zanverse and you can continue your attack versus aim shot where you've just hit for 1.2 million. You're already behind on the numbers and you're going to further fall behind when you take advantage of Zan. Now with that said, you can kind of play the middle ground and do a Zanverse into charged aim shot. It takes a lot of timing, but even then, if you do 1.2 million, that's not much when it comes to the Zanverse proc. So that is the reason why I do not use charged aim shot in these situations. Those downtimes when Sodom changes phases, it's just better to do other things. Get PP, maybe proc a crash so that your next phase you're doing more damage, or just doing more damage effectively with the time that you have. Now that where I messed up, I should have done Ein. But, of course, you'll recover. Here. Now I didn't heal. I was around 730, 780, I forget. But I didn't heal because this is one of the things, especially as Tekker Lester, you're going to need to get very good at, which is minding how much damage does Sodom really do to me. When should I heal versus when should I just keep on piling on the damage? As you notice, I was at 730, 780. Of course, I'm healing with Vigorous Response, even though at depth 100, your healing does get cut almost in half. Even if I didn't get all that health back, I was going to survive the hit. And then I'll find another opportunity to heal when it's more convenient. I'm going to start stashing in the damage. And you see there, I used Ein to guard, Serpent Air, dash back in. I don't want to take these hits. Now, the reason I don't want to take these hits, because I could have, it wouldn't have mattered too much. I wasn't worried about Sodom. And we talked about this a little bit in the last video. But now this is the perfect example of the other things that you need to focus on, which is this bad boy right here. This lightning pillar. In the wind and lightning stage, and of course subsequently the wind lightning phase of Sodom, this is probably the most dangerous thing. And so the reason why I did not want to take that hit was because given the angle and everything that was going on, I was not too sure how close I was to this. Because if it went off and I was right on top of it, or at least close enough to take a hit, that could have caused me problems, especially if I had let Sodom hit me. And so that's just something to be mindful of, is that sometimes this is not the issue. Everything around this or it is. So one thing just to keep in mind. And we'll actually see this now. There, I mistimed the gravity pull. Usually what I like to do is I like a full Ein shot, and then right when it explodes, I stress. That's not important. I had full health. And I'm not going to be disrupted because of the super armor frames with Ein And so still the most effective thing to do, as you see that iron shot did 460,000, is to still continue with that sequence and then make up the health difference later. As you notice there, proc crass, know where, or it's not going to do an attack where it is, you know, resetting. Those are the opportunities you have to get PP back. Those are the opportunities you have to safely proc crass. Once again, here we go. Got PP back, and then we go in. Generally speaking, the most optimal thing you can do, actually probably the only thing you can do when we're talking about, is spam ein. Now, of course, timing, what you're doing, the stars aren't always going to align, which is fine. One of the things you can do here, if you're like, crap, I've mistimed it. Do I want to burn PP on another ein, which for me, ein costs about what, 25, 26? I got it pretty much to where it costs no PP in its craft, but that's still a big hit. Normal attack, because what normal attack does is that it buys you some time, it keeps you in the same position in the air, and then you can go into your ein spams. Just something to think about if you get in situations where you're like, crap, I'm gonna mess something up, either burn PP or take the hit. Let's skip through some things, because there's only a couple more things we want to show, and that is the flame pillar. This is the flame pillar when he's in his, or it's in its fire ice form. And this is essentially a one-shot if you get hit by it. There's a multitude of ways you can avoid it with Gunslash or wand. You could drop down in Nabarda, but of course we want to keep the damage going. We're trying to optimize damage to the best of our abilities, though what I'm doing, my timing's a little weak. It could be better, but essentially trying to be as effective as possible. One important thing, you'll notice that as he's floating in the air, he kind of does a lift and then he does another lift. When you chase him with Sophoe, you want to wait for that second lift. If you Sophoe after he does that first little aerial elevation, you are not going to chase him when he goes up higher, and of course you're just going to waste time in PP. So you want to be mindful of, hey, wait for that second lift where he goes up, and then you chase. Now, what did I do here? I was doing as much damage, I was spamming ein, and really what I was doing in the air was spamming ein just to buy me time. You know, when you have the PP, ein is a great timing mechanism. But when I knew the flame pillar is about to go off, I dropped down, charged Xanverse, and this is where I used Slash Rave. As you noticed, I was completely in the flame pillar. It didn't hit me because when you use Slash Rave, and you hit a target, you are invulnerable. Anything that's happening, you basically don't care. And so just wanted to really highlight that as this is a way you can really still keep your damage up to a fair degree. My timing was bad. I can work on that. But keep things going, keep the damage going, and not get one-shotted and ruin your run. Technically, you can do this later on in his lightning and wind phase, but I have another method for that. The reason why I don't use that method here is just because where he drops to the ground, the flame pillar, timing things, that can get a little dicey. So I play it safe. So now let's find that next situation. So pretty standard, nothing crazy here. In this situation, this is nothing big. But you'll notice he gets higher and higher and higher. It's probably in your best benefit or your best interest not to chase him. Just because the higher and higher he goes, the more and more you have to chase, you're out of position. Sure, you're still doing damage, but eventually he's going to drop to the air. Drop to the ground. You're in the air. You've lost more time. You're not doing as effective damage. So as you'll see me do here, once he gets too high, I'm going to drop, I'm going to set up, I'm going to reset Remegit and also Xanverse because I have the time to do both. And then as he comes down, I'm going to be hitting him with everything. Now in part one, this is what I was talking about. You'll notice that Sodom was doing its tantrum, and I called it the tantrum when it's just slamming its hands or its arms on the ground. It really doesn't care what you're doing. It's just, you know, it's doing its own thing. In most situations, what I would do here, if I didn't have this giant tornado that wants to ruin my run and potentially lightning around me to make sure my run is ruined, I would probably recast Remegit or even Xanverse, because when he's doing his tantrum, yes, you can chase him, but chances are, because of how it's moving, you're going to be hitting its back. You're not going to be hitting its core. It's just not effective. So you can do other things in preparation for when you can be more effective. But in this case, as you noticed, the thing in the lightning and wind phase I'm really conscious about, more so than anything, is this tornado. And as you see, I'm smack dab in the middle of it, and it's going to hurt somewhat. But as you notice, I'm prepared for it with my Megaverse. And if you remember from the past video, I have Megaverse crafted to where it only costs 11 PP. Because I don't care about the charge times for Megaverse. Charging Megaverse, especially in a one-on-one situation, is overkill. Usually. There are situations where, yes, charging Megaverse and face tanking is beneficial and effective. But in this case, I just need to conserve PP to make sure that when I do need this, and then need another attack to make sure my health stays high, I didn't run out of PP because it took 9 more than it needed to. And of course, the tornado is probably going to come back again. And I'm preparing for it. Now, if you noticed, I did 3 Eins to parry his Deus Burst, or whatever you want to call it. But I didn't let that next Ein go into a shot, and I didn't go into Rage Dance. The reason I did not go into that was because that tornado, that game ending or that run ending, that's the thing I'm mindful of. So when I did Strez, I wasn't too sure how fast it's traveling, where I'm going to be. So I just preemptively said, hey, I need to throw something out that's going to give me some guard frames. Rage Dance and Serpent, while I have super armor, I don't want to be taking those hits from that tornado because it can take me out. This lightning pool right here, even though I'm not close to it, I'm close enough to be mindful of what's going on. In addition to Sodom, could easily ruin this run. I popped Megaverse because I see it coming. It's right in my path. There's no way I'm getting out of this. I'm going to have to take this hit, but I've got Megaverse. It's protecting me. I've got full health. I'm preparing for this thing that's, in most situations, if I didn't do this, would have been a game over. And as you can see, my health drop went down to 1200, but essentially it bounced back and forth just because of how Megaverse works, but it settled on 1300. So as you can notice, if I didn't do Megaverse and if I messed some other things up, it could have taken me out in addition to what Sodom is doing. We can go over the final phase. Now, as you notice, 315, if you're in the 315, 330, or of course 4 minutes, you're pretty good. I don't do this phase relatively well, and I do want to stop there because this is something that we also covered in part 1, which is essentially cast speeds. I'm charging Xanverse, and I'm going to release it early. The reason for that is Gunslash cast animations are slower, and so you have to be mindful and give yourself some buffer room to cast Xanverse so that when Sodom crashes down with his arm, you are able to respawn. And so as you notice, I casted Xanverse early and preemptively went into Ein to parry his arm to continue my damage. This is something you just want to be mindful of. Being knocked away and having to recover and losing that 2, 3, whatever seconds, that's something that you just want to avoid. Serpent airs, this is just trying to get as much damage in as possible. Nothing crazy. I'm sure I could be doing it better. It's just one of those things to where I knew I could clear the run. I probably wasn't going to get an amazing time. I was just kind of going standard, keeping things consistent. Now here, this is where I use aim shot. Now, of course, I missed both of them for some reason. That's where you do that situation, and of course, go right back into your rotation. Now, that was weird. That was a glitch. You'll notice that I didn't do anything and I got hit, but nothing happened. It's because I actually casted Ein. The game just decided not to register it, but gave me the super armor anyway. Now here, in this situation, when he's going to do his big one-shot, there are better ways of handling this. Specifically, you parry the timing with Ein. Now, of course, the problem with that is if you mess up on the timing, you are dead. Your run is not done, but you can imagine I've got time to spare. But if you didn't have time to spare, your run is done. So this is once again where /rave comes into play. I'm just going to completely ignore his one shot. and then he's dead. There are going to be things that you might be more comfortable with, but really it's all about optimizing, really understanding how you're not necessarily playing against Sodom, you're playing against the clock. And so when you think about taking an action, doing a sequence, using this PA over this tech, so on and so forth, understanding how do I make the most use of the time that I have, especially as Techer Lester, or just Techer in general, where we don't have a lot of time. 1344, second fastest time in JP. The fastest time is 1317. Can Techer, specifically Techer Lester, get under 13 minutes? It's probably possible. Building those patterns and developing that as you climb is going to help you improve your chances of clearing depth 100. And then, of course, once you get proficient, hopefully you guys start challenging, you know, the 1344s and the 1317s, and let's see if somebody can get towards that 13 minute. But other than that, appreciate you guys sticking around. I hope this was helpful. Of course, any questions that you have, feel free to leave a comment or even message me or hit me up on Discord. You know, we've got Techer Discord. I'll have all of that information in the link below on both videos as well. I'd like to hear from you guys, your thoughts, and of course, if you figure out something that's working, that's better than how I approach it, because of course there are. I don't have the fastest time, so obviously there are. Let me know.